And we had 12 technical specialists that are listed in the report here. We want to thank ITC, and particularly the Oversight Committee that spent a lot of time reading and looking at our document. And the 12 technical specialists that were a little different than earlier IFMATs. This IFMAT, we had the 5 core team members that were on point for this report for the whole 3 years, but then we had 12 technical specialists. Some of them are in the audience today. Mike Dockery, he's here somewhere there. Dave Wilson, George Smith, who's up here with me, Tim Vredenburg. Were instrumental in bringing some real expertise to IFMAT-IV. And we really want to thank those technical specialists, as well as we had 5 students. We had 5 native students that we interviewed across the whole country that came on. And again, I won't go through all the backgrounds that they're in the acknowledgments, but they did help give us a different perspective and did review and had an opportunity to go through the IFMAT process as Serra Hoagland had done in IFMAT-III. And this IFMAT, we had Serra on as, I believe, is the first tribal member on the IFMAT team, and also had both Mike Dockery and Dave Marcel as technical specialists as tribal members working on the IFMAT-IV. So we're very, very happy to have those folks and that new additions to our team. We were able to site visit 37 tribes. That meant an actual team of anywhere from 3 to 5 of the technical specialists and core team members showed up, and 37 tribes hosted us. We did speak to 41 tribes. Some tribes we did not do site visits, but we spoke to 41 tribes. And in addition to that, we did also contact 6 additional tribes that for some reason either we couldn't schedule or they chose not to participate. So we really made quite an effort to get across the nation by region input from all the different tribes of all different sizes. We want to especially thank Laura Alvitres. Laura was instrumental in helping keep us on task every year. I do my quarterly reports with Laura, and Laura was a great help to me, especially as the coordinator, and I appreciate that. We also had an editor named Adam Harrybrook. He couldn't be here. Adam was the editor on this report, worked closely with the core team in getting the final document out. And our typesetter was Margaret Parker. We had used her quite a bit over the years, and she was really is the one who did the layout and the format for the report. So real quick, we call it a 2-pager. It's really 1 page, both sides. This is IFMAT-IV and the core team, as well as the technical specialists. This is what we thought were the key findings. That if you need a document, you're going to go talk to someone in Congress or someone who wants to know about the IFMAT. That's what our 2-pager was put together for. In addition, we did a separate executive summary. I believe it's 17 pages, but what I want to share with you on that is when you go through the executive summary, you will see where we see A1, which is task A, finding 1, or H10, which is task H, and finding 10. And I'm not going to go through. There's 11 tasks that 8 of them were mandated in the NFIRMA, in the Act, and ITC added 3 more. But as you go through the executive summary, if you wanted to find the background information, it actually lists in here the task and the finding, which you would then be able to go directly to the almost 300-page document, which has all the background information and all the findings and recommendations. So we did want to make the executive summary as condensed as we could, but also easy for you to find the information. When you get to the electronic copy of this document, it's actually pretty easy to email the whole document in one email. So we did that. I wouldn't try to print that electronic copy because the pictures probably won't come out well, but you can get the whole document in one email. And what I'd like to share with you here is you go to the table of contents on that electronic copy and click anywhere on that table of contents and it will take you directly to wherever you want to see in the document. So there's three parts of the document, the 2-pager, the executive summary, and the main document. And if you just have the main document, the executive summary is included in the main document. So you don't have to have both. The executive summary is in the main doc. And then we have special parts in there with vision, non-timber forest products. Again, I'm not going to go through all those. Some of the team is going to talk about the key findings. What I do want to share is quickly is in the appendix. We do have the act and the firm act in there. We produced a site visit handbook for the tribes on IFMAT-IV so that we could help the tribes be prepared. That's in there. It has a lot of information, particularly on past findings and recommendations. We have a trip log of every tribe that we visited and who attended there. The self-governance section talks about the authorities that self-governance tribes can have access to. In this IFMAT, we did a crosswalk. So we looked at the previous 3 IFMATs and we did a crosswalk to see what has been accomplished, what's still kind of up there needs to be addressed. And if you go to that crosswalk, you will find also the task of which task that issue could be found, and we also put the page numbers in that crosswalk. So for those that want to look at what's happened in the past, IFMAT 1, 2, and 3, as compared to this present IFMAT-IV, that can be found in the crosswalk. We also did a short write-up of what we felt, this IFMAT team felt, what IFMAT-V might want to consider looking forward. We also did an extended, or a little deeper dive into allotments and into Alaska. So you will find allotment section and an Alaska section in the main document, but there is also additional information in the appendix for both the allotments in Alaska. So before we turn this over to the key findings from the members, I would like to say that we have 4 of our core team members here. John Gordon couldn't be here, and he gives everyone his best wishes. He couldn't make it here. The core team with our technical specialists in the 3 years did not have an opportunity to actually get face-to-face till today. And we're missing John Gordon, unfortunately. We actually produced the whole IFMAT-IV report over Zoom, virtually, which we didn't even know if we could pull it off, but we did. So I did want to share with that because our first year in 2020, we were deep into COVID. We couldn't site visit. We did a lot of Zoom calls. We did all our site visits in 21 and 22, and actually finished them all last year in October. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Vinny. We do have kind of a logical order, and we've got John Sessions next.
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, I'd like to certainly thank the Beach Lake Band and ITC for this great symposium. I was out front, and I asked about registration, which I was told was about 230 or so. And I asked, how many of those are women? And they said about 40%, which I thought was an outstanding number. It's quite progressive. All right, so as Vinny said, there were 8 mandated tasks and 3 from ITC. I would believe for 3 of those tasks, we call them tasks A, B, and F. But I was responsible for looking at funding compared to adjacent landowners, forest condition and forest planning procedures. And so I had the help of some technical specialists, as Steve said, they're here in the audience. I think we know Dave Wilson here, who spent a career here actually in, he started on the Menominee and then later at Boulevard, and then later on with the Forest Service. But Dave helped me, and Mark Rasmussen, the principal of Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. Lloyd Berlin, who was Commissioner of Public Lands there in Maine. John Bailey, our Professor of Silviculture and Fire Management, and David Mossel, who was formerly Menominee, but is now the Forest Health Specialist in the Eastern region. So they were all very, very helpful. And I was thinking about what Steve or Vinny said about our specialists giving us a real experience, and the co-chairs had unreal experience. But okay, I'll let that go. Okay. Well, my task here for the next 7 or 8 minutes is to touch on major points of our 27 findings and recommendations in those 3 tasks. And certainly I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I would like to touch on some of the important points. And then later on, I think Steve has room for questions, and we're also going to have an implementation discussion tomorrow. So, the slide behind me, you can see summarizes a lot of the summary of our major findings regarding funding. I'm going to come back to that slide a little later, but you can be reading the fine print there. I'm not sure. It looks like it came out in pretty high resolution, Steve. There was some question about the resolution earlier. Well, first I'd like to say a few points about forest condition before I talk about funding and planning. And I wanted to say that in our tour of the 41 reservations and organizations, forest protection was the #1 goal. And there also was an increasing priority for traditional uses, including cultural burning, being extremely important. And also in our findings, when looking at the condition of tribal forests compared to their neighbors, the tribal forests continue to experience lower mortality than certainly the adjacent federal forests in all regions. The next thing I wanted to talk about was that forest biomass continues to increase in Indian country, even with these severe wildfires of 2020. But the most pressing forest health issue, particularly in the dry forest, is overstocking. And overstocking in the face of climate change makes it all the more pressing. For example, in the Pacific Northwest region, what we call wildfire hazard potential, it is the highest in Indian country as compared to any other owners. So it's just a pressing issue, and also is considered in the backdrop here in the slide in funding. So other pressing issues on the horizon is the emerald ash borer. It's a pest that has been around now a couple of decades. It's an import from Asia, and it's just deadly with the ash trees, virtually coast to coast. It's in the east now, but just this last year we've also found spots in Oregon. So it's coast to coast, and it's certainly a pressing issue for really hundreds of millions of trees in the United States. I want to also comment about, in this forest condition, about the gap between the allowed annual cut and timber harvest. And this gap has been growing now for a number of years, meaning what say they would like to have for allowed annual cut and what's actually being cut. And this gap is due to funding, is one large issue, markets, many of which have disappeared with the changing federal policies nationwide. And lastly, some tribes, their priorities have just changed, and those haven't been reflected yet in forest management plans. But if we look at this gap indicates a potential revenue loss in the last 10 years that could approach $400 million. So I'll give you an idea about what the potential value of achieving that allowable annual cut if tribes would really like to do that. Now, a couple of other comments on forest condition. Timber stand improvement, there's a backlog in timber stand improvement. There's been a backlog for at least 40 years. And much of that backlog has come down, but it still persists at about a level of 300,000 or 400,000 acres nationally. There's also a backlog in planting, and this backlog had been drifting on down, but it had increased sharply following the 2020 fires, and now it's about 500,000 or 600,000 acres. Road conditions continue to challenge active forest management throughout Indian country. I remember looking at this in IFMAT-I in the early 1990s, where we estimated the backlog would cost about $200 million to address. And a recent study done by the BIA in 2019 suggested that $200 million is now $1.3 billion. And it's just a major issue. You drive across Indian country and you know immediately in many areas when you left Indian country. And so it's just a major impediment. The Department of Interior did a study where they say only on the Indian road system, meaning on the actual BIA system, they say only 13% of those roads meet an acceptable service. So DOI understands the problem, and it's just one that needs to be addressed. Looking behind me at this screen, you can see that if you look at that blue part of the bar, that's what we call the gap. And it's the gap in funding that tribes receive compared to what federal agencies receive for managing their forest lands. If you looked at the cost of managing on their lands and said, if you applied that funding structure to Indian country and the needs of Indian country, you can see that blue bar has been, that blue section of the bar has been increasing for the last 20 years. Okay. Although there's been a small gain in real funding, because these are all that moved forward in 2019 dollars. Although there's been a small gain in real funding since IFMAT-III, the funding gap continues to widen between what the agencies are getting and BIA gets on comparable lands. Tribes continue to be funded for both forest management and fire preparedness, and only about a third of what the Forest Service gets on a per acre basis. More than 50% of tribal forestry staff are funded at levels less than prescribed by the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act and codified in the CFRs. That TPA-based funding, that's this tribal priority based funding that funds tribal staffs. For most tribes, that's not kept up with inflation, and that's been especially severe for those tribes that have compacts. If you look at the President's 2024 budget, if implemented with all the funds that the President is requesting that will barely keep up with inflation and do nothing to close the gap, the funding gap there. We estimate that a 75% increase will be required for forestry and wildfire to enable BIA to reach parity with the other agencies. With regards to forest planning, in my last 2 minutes, I'll say that all tribes now have a forest plan. But this policy that was established in 2015 of non-expiring plans, while serving an immediate need to allow timber harvest to proceed, has resulted in inventories and forest management plan updates not remaining current, such as not addressing pressing issues, new issues such as climate change, carbon sequestration, and changing tribal priorities. I'd also like to comment a little bit about this very, very interesting panel that we heard just before lunch on carbon credits. Carbon offsets and timber management, they can coincide, but on dry forests, overstocking is the issue. And that amount of carbon either has to be redistributed or reduced. And that question is going to be a very pressing question for tribes in much of the West. In most forest management plans, the firm requires estimates of the staffing and funding needed to carry out the forest plan. In the vast majority of forest plans, there's no discussion of the staffing and funding necessary to carry out those plans. And in IFMAT, for all forest estimates, we have in principle believe that the Secretary's approval of the forest management plan is a recognition of the funding required to implement the forest management plan. And lack of this funding information in the plan jeopardizes proactive lobbying for needed finance. I'd also like to say 2 more points, that there's an inadequate technical expertise available to tribes for modern inventory and harvest scheduling methods to support operational forest planning. CFI system, which is an excellent system, has been in place many, many years. It's one that certainly the BIA tribes should be proud of, but it's being stretched to provide information for which it was not intended. And there are other methods that would meet operational planning needs at lower cost and more rapidly. And then on some forests, interpretation of the allowable annual cut, what that means in terms of what level the tribes can harvest, that is hindering sustainable forest management, and we feel needs to be revisited. And lastly, tribes might be better served by a forest management plan that integrates forest land, woodlands, hazardous fuel reduction, non-forest timber products, and transportation into a single plan. So, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions later in the panel, and perhaps tomorrow we'll have our implementation discussion.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. It's an honor, and part of my major kind of thread to all this was staffing, and we'll get into that in more detail. But a lot of it is comes down to capacity. All of you are doing 28 things in an increasingly challenging environment, and you have to make decisions about what kind of capacity you have. And to that point, I want to recognize that you're all here and you made that decision, that it was worth it. But also, you took a lot of your time, many of you who hosted us over the last 2 years, you gave some of your very limited capacity to share your issues with us. And we were humbled by that and took that very seriously. Our report is an attempt to kind of give back in a way and help you all solve some of these issues that you're dealing with all the time. So, as John said, we're here today. We're here on tomorrow night to talk about implementation, but also, and I think I speak for all of us, including Dave and Mike, is come talk to us at break or after dinner. We're happy. We're all here. I kind of joke we should get Ask Me About IFMAT t-shirts, but it never quite happened. But but we're here and we would love to talk to you. So in coming back to staffing, in a way, the situation has been kind of it's not to use the word bleak, although I just did. It is getting worse, and part of it is, as John pointed out, the funding that may have been adequate under NFIRMA 20, 30 years ago for tribes that have compacted often hasn't changed for inflation. So in real dollar value, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and it's starting to really show in staffing. In general, the pattern for the last 3 IFMATs is that overall, staffing was going up, BIA staffing was going down, but that was partly because tribes were compacting and contracting. And there was this kind of increase, at least in the number of professional foresters working for tribes in the BIA from 91 until 2011. And that dropped. For the first time, the total number of foresters, the number of tribal foresters dropped between 2011. And I don't know if anyone mentioned this, but we use 2019 as a baseline. Normally we go in 10-year increments. The funding position analysis was usually done every 10 years, which gave us a lot of our data. We stopped at 2019, obviously, just because of the impacts of COVID. So these staffing numbers are pre-COVID, and what we've seen is an overall drop. In fact, since the first IFMAT, the overall forestry number of people working in forestry for the BIA and tribes has dropped 19%. There is an average of just 1 forestry staff per 18,000 acres out there right now. That's half. The Forest Service is about 1 to 9, so it's about half of that. And if you look at the funding numbers, tribes are getting about roughly a third of what the Forest Service is getting, and is managing double the number of acres per personnel. In terms of number of acres per professional forester, in IFMAT-III it was 1 to 30,000. It's now about 1 to 40,000. So, that things are getting rougher out there for all of you. There has been, in terms of the demographics, we were a little bit worried in IFMAT-III that there was only 1.5% of the workforce was under 30. Good news is that's gone up to 11%, which is kind of a normal balance, but the other side of that is it was a 5% drop in 30 to 40-year-olds and a 5% drop in 40 to 50-year-olds. And half the workforce now is over the age of 50. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. One of the shining sort of examples was the timber team that the BIA has put together to kind of give surgical, kind of strike force type of capacity to tribes, helping them get out timber sales and salvage and other things. I think that kind of thing needs to be amplified. I think there are a lot of other areas where a mobile team, the BIA can lend to tribes or agencies to help with that capacity, whether it's NEPA or BEAR or some of these other things that come up. It's going to be a very helpful way of dealing with some of these issues. We also heard of one tribe who was, when they were trying to negotiate their annual funding agreement, they were trying to actually talk directly about their staffing needs, how many staff they had needed, and get funding equivalent to the appropriate GS level with the Bureau or the federal government. Again, trying to come up with a number that realistically supports the number of people they have to do the job directly in terms of staffing. I think that sort of thing needs to happen as without this cost of living allowance sort of thing that's happening. It's just there's less and less buying power, and I think that's the real reason we saw that big drop in the number of foresters, number of staffing in the last 10 years. It's just been 10 more years, and inflation, especially recently, has been pretty out of hand. Dave Cleaves would be very upset with me if I didn't talk about climate change and which is again something that we came up in IFMAT-III. It was sort of a special topic here in IFMAT-IV. I think everyone knows that we're seeing manifestations of that in all sorts of different levels, whether it's different wind patterns, precipitation patterns, extreme weather events, increased wildfire activity and behavior, and insect and disease is becoming sort of outside their historic range of variability. There's the general, again, I think due to capacity, everyone's out there trying to figure it out on the ground, and there's some really innovative and interesting work being done. But a lot of that is about the capacity to be able to plan, to be able to get the information you need. Both the Forest Service and the USGS have climate science centers, but you have to be able to access them. You have to be able to develop those networks. You have to kind of go out and meet people and talk to them and try to figure out who can help you, or get access and have the time to read the journal articles, which are actually hard to get a hold of if you're not in an academic institution because of paywalls around journal articles. So it takes an extraordinary amount of work where we saw people who were really well networking were actually getting help from somebody on the National Forest or the research station or here or there. It's because they had gone to meetings, they had actually been able to find the time to kind of develop those networks. We sort of in general see a need for better integration of climate change into planning. It's kind of a new world for everyone, but there is technical assistance out there, and hopefully tribes will get better access to that as they start to do more planning. What we've seen in general, going back to John's comments about overstocking too, is a lot of, when we ask about what are you doing about climate change, the general response is to go for resilience, right? And that makes sense. If you can give trees more resources to deal with drought and to fire and to be able to fight off insects, and you're sort of trying to do all of that in one. So there is a lot of work out there on resilience, trying to create a more resilient forest. In some cases, that means decreasing density in a way that one of the questions related to climate change we're also looking at is tribes' access to carbon markets. And it seems to me that there is at least a potential conflict there between managing for resilience and managing for carbon. And I think that's something that the tribes are going to sometimes have to make decisions about as they go forward. I haven't been checking my time. I got a minute? Oh, okay. Well, in that case, thanks everybody. Trying to say it all in 10 minutes is probably not exactly, I'm not doing the best job of it. But again, please come talk to all of us. We'd love to talk to you more about this. And thank you.
So I was the sergeant of arms, is that the technical title, as a 5th grader, so I'm a magic woman at timekeeping. So sorry, Adrian, here I am over here. I didn't hurry up, my bad. So Gwasi, Dawae, greetings everybody. My name is Serra Hoagland. I'm probably speaking way too close to the mic, so sorry if it's extra loud, but I work with USDA Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and I've been on this core team for the last 3 years, and I wanted to start my comments off about the people, because I think this report is really about the people. I mean, it's also about trees, but it's what you all are doing out there in Indian country and Indian forestry. So thank you, Steve, for getting this group together and moderating our session. We appreciate you wrangling us, or herding cats, as I think you said. I also want to thank those of you in the audience who were part of the site visits. So the 31 tribes that we visited, are any of you out there in the audience that you can raise your hand? Or maybe we hosted you on a virtual call. Thank you so much again for letting us come and visit your lands and learn about your programs and projects. It takes quite a bit of effort to host the IFMAT team, and we just really appreciate your time and energy. Also want to thank the BIA regional offices and the national office that we visited with as well in this 3-year period. I didn't think I'd get an opportunity to thank the core team but I do want to take a moment to, number one, John Gordon, who's one of our co-chairs and who's not here today, but I know he really appreciates the emphasis that we're putting on the IFMAT report. But John Gordon, as John Sessions as well, has co-chaired this report for the last 4 decades. And so John Gordon, hopefully many of you know him, but he always helped us and reminded us of our independence and us to remain unbiased as a core team as we're putting together this assessment. John Gordon also kept us very grounded, and his experience in his career really proved foundational to our report. I'd also like to thank John Sessions over here, my colleague. He was really the engineer and the one that really hit home all the numbers and the analyses that are presented here in our report. And he might not look like it right here, but when you get him out in the woods, he's like a kid. He gets really giddy out there, and he just loves it. I mean, he will calculate things in his head and go back and think about and double check those numbers. So John Sessions really was a big asset to our team. Also making sure that our findings were defensible and credible. So when this goes to Congress and when you all are using this to speak to your representatives, we really have to think a lot of what John Gordon brought to this team. Vinny was the glue to our team as the program manager. Great description of the captain and the player on the team. Vinny held us together during really challenging and complex situations when we faced different hardships. And he handled all the logistics. So kudos to Vinny. There's a lot that had to be sorted out for all these site visits. And Adrian had the hard task of doing the surveys for the tribal site visits. So just appreciate Adrian taking on that charge. And he's kind of like our walking historian and being able to look back at records and just really appreciate the core team. So sorry to take up that time, but these folks have really put in an immense amount of effort over the past few years to get together this report. Vinny mentioned the technical specialists. I do want to mention a few. Greg Dillon at the U.S. Forest Service Fire Lab helped us out with the wildfire risk assessment that's here in the report. George and Tim are down there on the line, but they helped immensely with Task G, and they need their Itara capes up here. Marla Emery, who's not here, but she aided us in doing the non-timber forest products protocol. She's one of the nation's leading experts in non-timber forest products, and she really helped in that way. Mike Dockery, who's there as well, was one of the other tribal members associated with the IFMAT-IV report, and Mike helped us out with the tribal vision work, the climate change work, and he and I were able to sort of collaborate one-on-one, coming at this report from an Indigenous perspective. And then Vinny had mentioned our student participants, but just to give them a quick shout out, that was one of the tasks I was charged with, was coordinating the student participants for IFMAT-IV. So that was Anthony Sioko, Austin Derglo, Tyler Everett, Hannah Funk, and Chase Christopherson. And so those, I think, are really going to be the future of maybe IFMAT-V and help us out on site visits. So there are 2 sources of funding to put this report together. One primarily being the BIA funded this, but the U.S. Forest Service also funded 30% of my time to work on this. And I haven't run the total numbers, but I think maybe Vinny would agree that's 20 to 15% of the funding for this came from the U.S. Forest Service. So thank you to them for supporting my IPA while I worked on this. My main duties and responsibilities for IFMAT-IV was, as I mentioned, work with the student participants, and then I also was a main facilitator for leading the executive summary, so that's one of the 3 documents that you have there, and I'll talk about that in a second. I was also in charge of facilitating Task G, which I'll provide some comments on, Task J, and then the non-timber forest products section. And when I participated in IFMAT-III as a graduate student observer, my main goal was to listen and to interpret and observe what's going on in Indian forestry. And I took those same morals and values for IFMAT-IV, and we repeated that as a team. We were really there to listen to what you all have going on in your programs. But now to sort of jump more into the nuts and bolts of my talk, and I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So if you like, go and get out your report out of your bag now, and we can nerd out about this. So take your second and pull out the report, because Steve was okay with me doing this exercise. But yeah, this really is the main source of the status of what's going on in Indian forestry today. There are 310 pages to this report. That's 86 pages longer than my own dissertation, and it is fantastic. This is a lot of great resources that have been here. So I did want to touch on the methods. So you got your report out, right? Everybody get your report out. So that's up in your hotel room. Flip to page 3 of the executive summary, and at the very top of that page, you'll see our methods. So it really was broken down, just to make this point clear, 4 main things that sort of built our report, and this is how we surveyed tribal forestry. 1, we had our surveys, our tribal members survey, our workforce development survey, and our non-timber forest product survey. So we did have sort of these paper documents and things that we were collecting back during our visits. The second thing we did was having these site visits and the interviews with tribes themselves, as well as BIA offices and staff with focus groups. The third thing was hosting these interviews and virtual calls with the BIA regional offices. And then this last one, which John Sessions sort of presented on and is here in the slide, was that comparative analysis. So those are really the methods that we used during these last few years. If you're interested on how we selected the tribes, you can flip to the appendix, which is A78. And there in the appendix, as a core team, we worked really hard to figure out a sampling scheme. So if you're a tribe that's sitting here in this room today and you weren't included in IFMAT-V, or in IFMAT-IV, I'd like for you to look at this and our sampling scheme and think, what sets us apart from what other tribes are doing today? And is there a possibility for us to be included in IFMAT-V? But if you're interested in our sampling scheme, flip to that page. And then now I'd like to talk a little bit about the executive summary. I was tasked with taking the lead on the first stab of drafting the executive summary. And just so you all know, as a core team, we went through all of our findings and recommendations for all of those 11 tasks on multiple occasions, and we looked at which findings and recommendations really rose to the top and sort of were, in our eyes, needed to be prioritized. And then we had this massive document, then findings and recommendations. But from there, we clumped them and sort of clustered them into those 8 major findings. So that executive summary is intended to be general and brief and sort of like high level. So please utilize that as a resource. We spent a lot of time, and as Vinny mentioned, you can see the references. So if you want more detail, go to that specific task itself. Also in that executive summary, you have figures like what's up on the slide, and sort of key figures that are really intended to hit some of these themes home. Okay, going on to my other assignment, which was Task G, and I know my colleagues down here will be discussing that as well. But Task G, maybe some of you can look at the table of contents and see if I say this verbatim correctly. But Task G, I think, was it's by word count the longest task that is developed by NFIRMA, and maybe being the new kid on the block, they assigned it to me. I can't even remember how this happened. Maybe they had a meeting and said, Sarah, you get to do that one. But it was a challenging one for sure. But it's evaluating the feasibility and desirability of establishing minimum standards against which the delivery of forestry programs of the BIA in fulfilling the trust responsibility to tribes can be measured. So that's what Task G is, right? Okay, yeah, and everyone's like, can you repeat that? Really, it's like, can you give a report card to the BIA? Like, are they meeting some of these standards? So coming up with minimum standards was a fair amount of our workload. we recognize that state-of-the-art forestry could not be achieved until you set standards, and then you're also able to enforce standards, right? But there's the breaks in the system and the failures that happen when we're not able to achieve those standards, which goes back to this point that John was making about limited funding. IFMAT-I, back in 1993, did recommend that each tribe and the secretary come together and agree on what those minimum standards are for each tribe. And today we have ITARA. That's kind of like the case study that has come from that recommendation in the 90s. As John mentioned, each forest management plan, as required by NFIRMA, is supposed to include the basic staff and funding resources to carry out that plan, but not all forest management plans have that. NFIRMA also has minimum standards listed in it, basic staffing and funding, but as John mentioned, only half of the tribes actually receive what NFIRMA lays out, so it makes it a challenge. So if you want to look at what we found for Task G, look at the 310-page report, and you can look at all those findings and recommendations that we developed. And I know I'm running out of time, but Task J is on page 185 if you want to look at that. The non-timber forest products is found on page 35, and it's also the very first point that we made in the executive summary, talking about the stewardship of forests. And I'll just end with a final comment about IFMAT-V and looking to the future. And I'm really glad that John brought up the question about how many women were registered for IFMAT. And in Levi's opening comments this morning, for those of you who were in here today, he talked about what it felt like to be the only native at the table. Well, what do you guys think it feels like for me to be up here? This was tough. There was a lot of responsibility in this, and it's not to say that our non-native allies don't bring a lot to the table. They really do. But representation really matters for IFMAT-V. And we need to know where we are today in the grand scheme of how society is changing. And in many ways, IFMAT-IV still used a bit of a colonized approach to looking at what's going on in Indian forestry today. And I think for IFMAT-V, we really need to think deeply about how to decolonize some of that. Mike's up.
Good afternoon. I'm George Smith. I'm one of the technical specialists that were on the IFMAT team, and why on earth are we doing IFMATs? I don't think none of us mentioned, and probably oversight, why we do these IFMAT reports, and this is the third decade, 1993, 2003, 2013, and here we are in 2023 in IFMAT-IV, but it's a requirement in the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act, which is the organic statute for Indian forest management passed in 1990. And by the way, it's the only statute for management of forest in the nation that has a requirement that every 10 years an assessment be done of the adequacy, the funding, and the meeting the requirements of forest management for a particular agency. The Forest Service doesn't have anything like that. The BLM doesn't have anything like that. So it's very unique to Indian forestry, and it's a great thing. I think this assessment has, along with several other assessments, has been a real tool in advancing objectives of tribes in Indian forest management. And every one of them, as John Sessions has mentioned, has identified a tremendous shortfall in funding Indian forest management compared to other federal agencies. We're kind of sorry that the reports have not generated as much traction in Congress to get additional appropriations, but never giving up, and there's going to be a strong implementation team put together for this IFMAT, and I anticipate we'll have a lot of progress. One of the speakers this morning, Levi, offered several words of wisdom, and one of them that kind of struck with me in making this presentation this afternoon is you need to put your conversation in context. And I'm going to be talking about the transition of Indian forest management to self-governance and Indian self-determination, and taking the control from the BIA and essentially turning it over to the tribes. And that might sound rather negative towards the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I spent a 31-year career in the BIA, and I'm very proud of that career and the accomplishments that we made. But in no way is this, and comments I'm going to be making and kind of referring to some language in self-governance compacts meant to be bashing the BIA. Now, if you want to have some candid discussions with the BIA, go ahead and have those discussions, but that's not coming from me. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, and kind of the focus that I had as a technical assistant on the IFMAT-IV was transitioning to, Tim's going to help me here. I'm not a real technical guy. Transitioning from BIA control to direct tribal operation, which is self-governance and Indian self-determination. I've thrown a few pictures in here, and I know to Steve's or Jim that we're on a tight time schedule, and some of these pictures have nothing to do with self-governance. Well, maybe they do. I think every one of these are compact tribes. The first one is the Acoma Pueblo in Mexico, and just wanted to throw that in there because it gives a strong indication of woodlands on Indian reservations, and a lot of folks that are in the kind of the North Country don't really recognize what the woodlands are all about, but it's an important part of the tribal forest resource. Next slide. Okay, we're moving right along here. So, what really is the background for moving forward with tribal self-determination and self-governance in Indian forest management? It all started back in 1975 with the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And so we're, almost 50 years down the road since that statute passed. And it was the intent of a lot of the tribal leadership, some of the real prominent leadership in Indian country, the Congress and the administration, primarily the Interior Department, to enact this policy and authority whereby tribes could start taking the control and the management of their forests away from BIA direct operations and start taking over those operations themselves. And I'm going to be dating myself a little bit here. Some of the key folks that were involved in this movement, and I'm talking back in the 70s, were like Joe Dela Cruz from Cornwall, and Roger Jordan from the Lake States here, Wendell Chino Mescalero, Ada Deer from Menominee, and Wendell Mankiller, who was at that time the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And whenever I list people, I always regret it because I always leave people out, and I apologize for that. But those are some of the key leaders, and I have had an opportunity to work with many of these folks over the years, and really feel it an honor to have an opportunity to have been in on kind of the initial ground of Indian self-determination. So we're now into IFMAT-IV, and we're 3 decades from IFMAT-I, which started in 1993. Shortly after the passage of the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. And so what are some of the key observations over those 3 decades of time in regard, again, to the focus on Indian self-determination and self-governance? And we found that starting way back on IFMAT-I, there was an identification of, and it's in the report, an identification of kind of a disconnect between the way the Bureau of Indian Affairs was viewing what the tribe's objective was in forest management and what the real tribal objectives were in forest management. And I'm not kind of trying to put any blame on any side here, but the disconnect was that in the IFMAT report and the observations that were made by the team that the tribes really wanted a more balanced management and an achievement of a broad range of values, like cultural values, fish and wildlife habitat, and other values, rather than just revenue production and the economic value from the forest. And that was kind of an eye-opener. I don't think that at that time, we're talking about most of the operations were BIA tribal direct operations, and the tribes didn't have a lot of involvement in direct management of their forests, but it did really indicate that, maybe things were a little bit off track in how those forests would be managed. So that again started moving tribes, I think, more to tribal management of the forest under the 638 Act and then some later amendments which created the opportunity to enter into compacts. But to show how that transition occurred back in the first IFMAT, there were very, very few tribes that were managing their forests under self-governance or 638 contracts. And in the IFMAT-IV, over these 3 decades, of the 41 tribes that we gathered information from, and it's already been mentioned that we visited 37 and had virtual meetings with a total of 41, that 77% of all of those tribes that we gathered information from now are under some form of direct tribal operations of their forestry program, either through 638 contracts or into compacts. And so, kind of an observation along with that, and looking at kind of the disconnect that was occurring way back in the early 90s, that we're finding now that tribes are moving steadily and in a positive direction towards achieving their tribal vision for the management of their forest lands. And again, this more balance of values. And we had a lot of internal discussions as we were making these visits of that, more and more tribes are moving towards stewardship management of their forests and focusing on just revenue generation. I'm not saying that revenue generation isn't important to some tribes, but from where we were back in 1993 to where we are now, there's a drastic difference and a real movement towards stewardship management. And so how has this change occurred, or this transition? Well, again, I think that as more tribes have moved into self-governance and managing their forests, either under 638 program contracts or self-governance compacts, that they have been able to move towards what their vision was for being accomplished in forest management. And then another really, I think, positive thing that's happened as we went around and visited, a number of tribes, a great many of the leadership in the forestry programs of tribal members themselves. And, that was a goal way back in the early 90s when we set up an Indian intake program, and then there has been programs to get more and more students into forestry that, hey, it's really worked. There's a lot of tribal members that are in leadership positions, and by being in those positions, they've been able to achieve more of the tribal vision for the forest management. So what I wanted to do here is just kind of illustrate this. I'm not going to go through this whole list. This is the 41 tribes that we visited. From the East Coast to the West Coast, Southwest, Lake States, and it was certainly, I've been doing this tribal forest management, national resources management for, I'm going to say it, 60 years. In June 10th of 1963, I reported in on the Salish Kootenai Reservation, Flathead, as a green-eared forester right out of the University of Washington Forestry School that knew everything and was going to go and start managing tribal forests. And boy, did I make a mistake here, I didn't know anything. And certainly have learned a lot over those 60 years. But and all I want to illustrate here is if we move through the slides, you'll see all of the yellow highlighted information there. And what this table does, it shows the tribes visited. It shows, if it was a virtual meeting or a site visit, and a lot of them are both. and then what kind of governance occurs in those tribal forestry programs. And all of the yellow ones as we flip through here are ones that are either under 638 compacts or 638 contracts. And you can see out of that this is where we came up with over 70% of the tribes now managing under direct tribal operations rather than BIA operations. A couple more pictures, and I love pictures. One of them is Grand Ronde, and the other one is the Flathead Jocko Prairie. And I'm sure there must be somebody here from Grand Ronde, but I don't know how they manage to grow their trees as fast as they do. If you look at the leader on that Douglas fir, it must be 10 feet for this growing season. Well, I do know how they do it. They're in one of the most productive forest areas in the nation, or maybe the world, over in that Oregon Coast Range, and the trees really grow fast there. And then the other one is Flathead Jocko Prairie, and there's all of these pictures and information are in the IFMAT report, but another very interesting project that they have over there. I just want to touch on the chronology of authorities for the tribes carrying out forest management under direct tribal operation. We've already mentioned the 1975 Act 50 years ago of the Public Law 93-638, which is the Tribal Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And that provided the very first authority for tribes to contract programs and projects under the 638 Act and be able to carry these programs out under the tribal direction rather than BIA direction. And then there have been a number of amendments to the 638 Act. There was the 1988 amendment, which created the Tribal Self-Governance Program, and that's where you enter into compacts. And just a little bit of information there. The 638 contract program is quite a bit different than the compacts. The 638 contracts are administered within the organization of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Self-Determination Office in Washington, D.C. Compacts are elevated to the Assistant Secretary level in the department. So they're actually managed in different areas of the Interior Department. And then under the compacts, there's other things that are allowed to be done, like redesigning programs, and you can take your budget that comes down in an annual funding agreement, and the tribes can reallocate that money to meet their own priorities. So there's a lot of flexibility that can be done under compacts, and I think we found in visiting tribes that, you know, staffing is short, and even within the tribal leadership, that there are a lot of additional opportunities that tribes can do under 638 Indian Self-Determination, and particularly under the Self-Governance Title IV of the Act, which is the compacts, that, you know, if they wanted to exercise these additional opportunities, they certainly could do it. And then in 1990, we had Public Law 101-630, and that's the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. And I already mentioned that's the reason we do these IFMAT-IVs, and of course it's the modern statute, the most modern one out there compared to Forest Service and BLM for managing forest lands. And in that act itself, it said that the Secretary can carry out Indian forest management either directly or under 638's Indian Self-Determination Authority. So that 1990 FIRMA built in the ability to carry out tribal forestry programs under self-governance. In 1994, there was an amendment to the 638 Act, and that expanded it, went into Title IV, and allowed tribal self-governance compacts. 1 minute? Yeah. Oh, I knew he was going to drop the hammer. Okay. The last one I was going to mention is ITAR, and we're having a workshop on that on Thursday, so it's just really kind of the ultimate step in self-determination in forestry. Last slide. So this is kind of the culmination of everything I talked about. And this is a comparison of the applicability of rules, policies, and approval actions under different authorities and governance arrangements. That's kind of a mouthful. But what we're showing here is the difference between BIA and direct service operations, 638 contracts, cooperative agreements, 638 compacts, and then the new ITARA ITAMs. And you know, you have to follow an affirmative for all of them, yes. Follow the CFR 163 BIA regulations for all of them except the final one, which is now the new ITARA Act. You have to follow BIA policies, manuals, and handbooks. Yes, if it's BIA direct operations, the rest are no. If you're 638 program contract or compact, you don't have to follow those policies and manuals and handbooks. You don't have to, if you're a compact, you don't have to provide the BIA with the standards that you're going to enforce. That's internal to the tribe, and it's to advance the tribal interests and manage the forest. You do have to, one of them that you do have to apply to everybody is the standalone forest management plan, and then to have a wildland fire management plan that's usually an appendix to the forest management plan. In approval of the BIA use of its authority to approve timber sales and permits, you have to still have BIA approval, direct operations, compacts, contracts, except when you get to ITARA now, no longer does the BIA have to approve your timber sales, your prescribed burn plans, and Tim will be talking a little bit about how that's implemented. Comply with NEPA, you have to do it under all of the authorities, again, except under ITARA and ITAMs, and you replace an internal environmental review process developed by the tribe, replaces NEPA, and you have to have BIA approved prescribed burn plans. It's yes for everything except when you get to ITARA. Again, the authority can be vested within the tribe itself to approve its own burn plans. And then when you get to forest management deductions, and I think everybody in here knows what I'm talking about, you still have to, because that's in the statute itself and it's not in the 163 regulations, which you can replace under the firm. You still have to do an expenditure plan for forest management deductions. So, sorry, Steve, I think. Tim. Now, Tim's going to tell you how long.
I don't know. I'll keep it brief. On ITARA, we'll just have to wait till tomorrow for that workshop, and I'll try to leave some time, Steve, for questions. I appreciate that, George. Every time after a 60-year career, I think we call that long rotation, which is better than a short rotation. It is, but I learn something every time we visit. To tie in what George was talking about, we really observed an interesting context and moment in time as IFMAT-I, II, III, and now IV. We saw a transformation in terms of the makeup of tribes, moving from direct service to now 70% of the tribes we visited are under some form of self-governance. What we observed, and you'll see in the report, one of the major findings is that leaves it's the modern trust responsibility is not well understood. And we're seeing that tribes and the BIA are not necessarily on the same page in terms of how they're interpreting that trust responsibility. Just a quick example is as George lays out in his table, tribes under compact aren't required to follow manuals and handbooks. Whereas the BIA is, as they're trying to guard against mismanagement, those manuals and handbooks have been the primary instrument for ensuring and protecting the agency from mismanagement claims. And so there's as tribes are exerting more and more of their self-governance and trying to exert self-determination within their compacts and contracts and ITARA, there's a tension as BIA is trying to also interpret its trust responsibility through the manuals and handbooks. So one of the recommendations I think boils down to we need to improve our education and the communication between OSG, BIA, and the tribes to develop more of a common understanding of what that means, and with the ultimate goal of self-governance being the reduction of federal domination, that there really can only, now we're seeing, be fulfilled through ITARA, as it relieves that tension of interpretation of that trust responsibility. And it's interesting with ITARA, as it's the first time ITARA will show up in any of the IFMAT reports, and it's actually a product of IFMAT. The recommendation was in IFMAT-I, describing this kind of move to tribal self-determination. And just generally on ITARA, because it is kind of its opening act in IFMAT, we saw some general trends around the country. One was just a general a lack of awareness. Most tribes are not familiar with ITARA, what it means, what the acronym stands for, Indian Trust Asset Reform Act. And frankly, the BIA was not familiar with it either. There needs to be an increased outreach and training, both on the agency side and for tribal leadership. We also saw that a lot of tribes were interested in ITARA, but as all of us who work for tribes understand that we're stretched thin and lack the capacity to take on something new and different, even though it may carry the promise of streamlining and efficiency and lower costs. Many of us are just struggling to get done what we need to do today, and so the recommendation is there needs to be funding so tribes can afford to get help and secure the help they need to be able to write an Indian Trust Asset Management Plan and walk through that process. So if the tribe desires greater self-determination, they can have that, and funding and capacity isn't a barrier. And then finally, where the ITARA is being implemented, it's working very well, but we recognize that it's a 10-year demonstration project that sunsets in 2026, and so there's a recommendation to make permanent the ITARA statute, so that other tribes that are in the process of working towards approval under ITARA can have that opportunity to experience that self-determination and full self-governance. So back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Tim. It's impossible to digest, and that wasn't the purpose of this panel, 300 some pages in an hour and a half. But it's really to kind of entice you to take a look at this magnificent document and kind of use it. Don't just set it on the shelf and have it collect dust. Please treat it with a level of reverence and understanding of the amount of work and effort that many of you folks participated in, and the amount of effort that it took to so many people to put this report together. With that, we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. I don't know about the answer part of the questions anyway. If anybody has any pressing questions before break, we better go with our ITC president first, who popped up there. Your name and affiliation, please.
Cody, this is Hell from the Colville Tribe. So I just want to add some comments, because I know we reference the BIA a lot, and the BIA is referenced in the FIRMA. But when we look at the changes I've seen over my career, and I think it's been not necessarily documented in IFMAT, but it's factual. If we look at what the makeup of the BIA was 30 years ago, and really even for a number of decades prior to that, it was a lot of non-Indians, many from the East Coast, that were running tribal programs that really didn't understand how tribes worked or what their priorities were. So if you look at the change in BIA now, many of those BIA employees are tribal members from that tribe working in bureau positions. So I know in a lot of situations we point at the BIA, but a lot of times the limitations they have are funding limitations that Congress isn't passing along appropriations at a level that they need to meet those deliverables. So that's just a clarification I want to make, is I was a BIA guy for a while. I didn't work less hard as a BIA guy than I do as a tribal guy. So just keep that context, and almost all of them that I've ever worked with have the same interest, have the same dedication to work for their home reservations or the Indian country they work in, and we need to figure out how we move towards a more collaborative relationship. How do we help them get appropriations so that they can help us meet the deliverables in our management plans?
Hello, Joey Allen, Secretary of Agriculture and Natural Resources for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Appreciate the visit when y'all came out, I think shortly after the 2021 pandemic era, and got a good tour on Cherokee. I certainly don't have rose-colored lens when it comes to the BIA. You know, we had our tribal forester who was enrolled, and I requested records for 2 years, and he didn't keep any for 15. So we're still in a position where I guess there's room for improvement. I do have a question in terms of this report, and what was the BIA's response in terms of what you presented to them?
I'm not sure a moderator is supposed to answer that, but actually, you know, and I think Vinny will say that, but I think it's really important to take ownership in the document, and that's what I've been sort of saying. Individual tribes, academia, other agencies, the BIA. I think you bring up a really good point that I have mentioned a few times. You know, this is all of our improved Indian forestry throughout, and I think there needs to be an expectation that the BIA does take some ownership and digests and looks at this document. They were part of the review, you know, at the national and regional levels. So, yeah.
I was in the role of BIA Chief Forester for 2 of the IFMATs, and in working with the Intertribal Timber Council, we kind of put together an action plan to address the recommendations that were in the IFMAT report. And, you know, there's some of them that we really realize we're not going to be able to pull this off, but I think there is a good track record, and the ITC has done this. Don Mechanic with the ITC tracked this for a number of years through the different IFMAT reports, that a lot of the recommendations in there actually have been accomplished, and it's been a dual effort between the BIA and the ITC.
We did get asked that question here just in the last month or so. We did contact all 12 BIA regions and interviewed, I think 10 of them, all the central offices, FIP, Branch of Resource Planning, previously, and we also went back to the earlier IFMATs to see what involvement the Bureau had. I mean, the Bureau does fund it, it's required, it's congressionally mandated, so they are involved in the process, but as far as it is an independent assessment, so we asked the tribes what they thought, and then we evaluated what we saw, and we reported it independently.
Thanks, Laura. My name is John Martin. I work with ERI out of Northern Arizona University. And I have a question for Dr. Sessions. You mentioned that tribes are losing $400 million in revenue. Is that an annual figure, or is that over the term of a longer term?
I think I can answer that okay without the mic, but I had said over in the last 10 years. Okay. That's a 10-year number.
Okay.
And we say potential, right? Because it depends. There are some assumptions when you go to calculate losses in terms of the quality of the timber that was offered compared to timber that was not offered and what markets there were. But we were just indicating what the potential difference could be. And a large part of not being able to get the cut out, so to speak, is funding and staff capacity. Now, there's also some parts that have to do with markets, and also a part that has to do with, does the tribe actually want to get the cut out? But to answer your question, that was over 10 years.
All right, thanks again, Laura. I had another question, maybe for the whole panel, and I just wanted to know if the IFMAT review is limited to the requirements of the National Indian National Indian Forest Management Act, or does it include other criteria? Because I know the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act required IFMAT. I just wanted to know if it goes beyond the scope of that legislation.
Yeah, you can see I'm part of the communication program. The IFMAT report is guided by the 8 mandated tasks in the FIRMA, and the Intertribal Timber Council added 3 more dealing with landscape management and climate change, and that is what we focused on.
Well, thanks again, Laura. I just had one comment, and I really believe this, and I do believe the trust is not limited to the BIA. So I'm wondering if you looked at other federal agencies' actions in terms of fulfilling the trust. And thank you for all your work. Thanks.
The IFMAT team understanding is the trust responsibility. It does go beyond the BIA and reaches out to all federal agencies. And that is how we reviewed it in the IFMAT report.
In this IFMAT report compared to the others, and Serra was pretty much the lead on this, we were looking at a lot of cross-boundary type of activity of what tribes were entering into stewardship agreements and co-management agreements, Tribal Forest Protection Act activity, good neighbor across the tribal boundaries and in adjacent national forest and BLM lands, and you know, pretty much there was a recognition in all the discussions that the BLM, and particularly the BLM and the Forest Service, are really increasing their awareness of that trust responsibility. You know, for many years they've had, you know, policies and manuals that have talked about the trust responsibility, but really doing it out on the ground, I don't think has really started occurring until just some of this recent cross-boundary activity that's going on. And there's been mandates put out by both the Chief of the Forest Service and the Director of the BLM to all the agencies, the regional foresters and the BLM state directors, that they had a certain time period to develop their plans on how they were going to enter into these co-management stewardship projects with tribes in their area to get the tribes involved in the management of the federal lands. So I think that recognition of that trust responsibility is growing.
Well, let's thank this panel again, and they're going to be around for the next few weeks. So,